Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Great morning.
Thank you. Welcome to the Teachers Retirement System of the City of New York Investment Meeting on the first Thursday in November 1st, 2018. Thad, would you please call the roll?
John Adler, I am here. Thomas Brown.
Here.
David Kazansky.
Present.
Lindsay Oates. Deborah Penny.
Here.
Susanna Vickers.
Here.
We have a quorum. Thank you, Thad. And with that, we'll turn it over to Rokitan to take us away on our public agenda.
Great. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
We'll begin with September and talk through a little bit at a high level what the markets did and what that translated in terms of performance for passport funds.
I know.
Obviously, at the end of September, we started seeing a little bit more volatility in the markets, and that's persisted into October, through October, I should say. At the end of, I should say for the month of September, you'll recall the U.S. equity markets had a modest positive return, about positive 20 basis points. In developed markets outside the U.S., we saw actually a stronger environment, returns just shy of 1% there, positive 1%. And then in emerging markets, continued weakness as we've seen throughout the year. The emerging market proxy for the system was down about 70 basis points during the month of September. So all told, as you'll note in the performance figures, the diversified equity fund actually kept pace with the U.S. equity market. It had a return of about positive 0.2% relative to the hybrid benchmark. That was pretty much in line as well. Year to date, that brought the diversified equity fund's return, calendar year to date that is, to positive 7.3%. And for the same time period, the broad U.S. equity market was up about 10.6%, and the hybrid benchmark up about 7.7%. Really, again, what drove returns during the month of September was, modestly more positive performance from non-U.S. And then, as far as the other parts of the program, year to date, the defensive composite up about 4.4%, non-U.S. markets as a whole slightly negative, and in absolute returns, performance from obviously passive and the actively managed U.S. equity composite, more in line with the broad U.S. equity markets, although some relative underperformance from that active U.S. sleeve in the fund. For the balanced fund for the month, during September, that fund was down about 9 basis points, roughly in line with its benchmark. That brought the calendar year return for that fund to about positive 90 basis points. The international equity fund, with positive returns of about 60 basis points for the month, the calendar year-to-date return there is down by about 1.7%, roughly in line with its benchmark. The Inflation Protection Fund, the return for September was positive to the tune of about 10 basis points. Year to date, that fund is up about 1.3%. And the Socially Responsive Fund, having a tough month in September, down about 80 basis points versus the S&P, which was up by about 0.5%. The year to date return for that option is plus 9% versus the S&P at about plus 10.6%. So I will pause there and see if there is any questions on September.
Any questions for Mike? Okay.
I noted the increased volatility in the month of October.
I noticed.
Yeah, skip to the result.
What I wish we had more on at this point, but unfortunately we don't, with it just being the first day after the month, was how active management did more broadly during the month. And generally speaking, hopefully the volatility helps managers differentiate themselves, active managers differentiate themselves versus the broad market. And we'll certainly report back on that as we get more information. But in the U.S., you can see through Tuesday, the U.S. equity market, measured by the Russell 3, was down by about 8.4%. Yesterday was a positive day in the markets to the tune of about 1.4, 1.5%, so that number should be a little bit better for the month. But calendar year to date through October 30th, the U.S. equity markets were only up about 1.3%, so October, as you'll note, erased a lot of the strong numbers we saw so far during 2018. The international composite benchmark, that was down about 9.3%, and what drove returns there was pretty consistent underperformance, or negative numbers, if you will, across developed and emerging markets. And then in the small cap space, small cap was down a little bit more than the broad market there. Small cap down in non-US about 11%. The underlying benchmark for the defensive strategies composite, you can see there down by about 6.6%. So we'd expect to see some downside protection, as we would have hoped from that part of the program. Calendar year to date, that composite's up about 0.5% versus, as I mentioned earlier, the broad US up about 1.3%. The balanced fund benchmark, we'll expect to see down by about 2.6% for the month. And then as we look at the other options, the inflation protection fund's underlying strategy was down by about 1.3%, probably with a flat calendar year to date return for that fund. And the socially responsive equity fund's underlying strategy down about 8.3%, and we're probably looking at about a 0% year to date return for that strategy. So I will pause there.
Any questions about October? Any answers about October?
No answers.
Just thoughts.
Okay.
Okay. So the next item on the agenda is more of a verbal update with respect to the review of the screens for emerging markets. At this point in the process, we've talked to 3 providers out there that we think could serve as partners with the system to structure a process that allows the system to review and evaluate the portfolios, so that you can ensure that the belief statement is filtering into the portfolios, and that there aren't any, I would say, significant positions in the portfolios that are notably contrary to what you'd like to see given those beliefs. So at this point, we've actually gotten proposals from 2 of those 3 providers, and I think we'll continue to work with them to refine. But what stands out is, I think, being a very key part of this process is leaning on that provider to sit around the table with us and provide insight as to how they would envision synthesizing the beliefs, the thoughts in the belief statement into points of evaluation and scoring the underlying portfolio holdings. So think of these providers as having all the data metrics and scoring metrics to track portfolio or holdings, if you will, on a variety of different factors. What are the factors, and at what weight do we need to create a process so that the lens with which you review the portfolio is structured around the belief statement? And so I think that's going to be an iterative process, and we look forward to helping these providers refine their proposals a little bit more further, but also working with the board to provide some of the insight on how we refine that process and construct that process. And then I think another key input will be how we define the review, working with the managers so that they can understand, given the TRS beliefs, what are we seeing in their portfolios today that might otherwise lie outside, of where we want to be. And allowing managers to understand that process, I think, is very important. So in our minds, the next step is we're hoping to get a proposal from the 3rd provider as well. And then what we'll do is talk through with the board the different proposals. At this point, the cost seems like it's more modest and minimal, and we wouldn't expect this to be something that would be of significant cost to the system. But looking at the proposals, understanding how they intend to work with the board, and maybe informing them better as to how we can get the belief statement into their process for evaluating the portfolios. So.
So I'm sorry if we had already decided this, but I don't recall how we thought we would address the passive portfolio, because this kind of scenario would work for active managers. And then in terms of the index providers, did we talk?
We
no.
did not.
Okay.
I think it's an interesting and important question, but it has not been addressed yet.
Okay.
We have been focusing on the active managers,
Okay.
but that's clearly something that should be addressed.
So maybe once we have our active strategy, more thought out, that could inform what we might do on passive.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
So one thing that I've been noticing as we've been having this discussion over the past however many investment meetings was the concern that we have of making sure that whatever this company is going to do on our behalf and do for us is going to truly represent the thoughts and the feelings of this board. So I think maybe it would be a good idea to have a working group put together to kind of define what the process is going to be and make sure that we're all comfortable with what this screen is actually going to look like and how it's going to operate. And then we can bring that back to the board for discussion and consideration.
I think that would be helpful to us because it would give us a group that we could bounce ideas off of, rather than having to, right now, otherwise the board ends up being the working group.
Right.
So I think that would be helpful to us as we work through the process.
Great.
Should we, I'm looking down here, but the trustees are all down here today. Anyone disagree with the idea of creating a working group? Okay. So should we create the working group right now? Should we decide who's on it?
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to volunteer to be on it.
Oh,
Would anybody else like to volunteer to be on it, or should I pick volunteers as a joke?
I'll volunteer.
Okay. One of you guys?
Yeah, David's
Mr. Kazansky?
I volunteered.
Great. Okay, so the working group will be Dave Kazansky, Susanna Vickers, and John Adler. Okay, that's okay, right? Okay. Great.
So we'll coordinate maybe a next step discussion. Maybe by then we'll also have the third proposal, and we could review those together, and at some point even bring the providers in to speak with the working group.
Great.
And I'll bring this up to the working group, but just to let everybody else know, I'd like to somehow involve emerging market staff. Tatiana and John Mercer have been thinking about this with other boards, so
Great.
they can be ad hoc observers or something.
Great.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, anything else on emerging market? I think you guys have another item for the agenda.
Yeah, this is an informational update, and it's something that I know we've spoken about with the board in the past, but we think it's helpful to periodically provide an update and a refresher, just in terms of what's going on in the background from a process standpoint when it comes to reviewing the managers, ensuring that we're staying on top of them and understanding not only what's going on with respect to their firms, but what's going on with respect to their portfolio. It's helpful to hear their outlooks over time, and then as exceptions have come up in the past or updates have come up, we've brought those to the board, but we try to keep that more on an exception basis. So this is focused more on the passport funds, as BAM has a separate process that we coordinate with them on. And so this is the process that Rokatan and TRS has worked on together with respect to the passport funds. And there's two things that sort of happen in an ongoing way. We have an annual manager, more formal sit down with each manager, where TRS staff and Rokatan, we run through the roster of managers on an annual basis, and then there's also ad hoc meetings that happen between Rokatan's research group and the managers directly, and TRS's staff sort of off cycle. But we wanted to talk a little bit more about this, annual touch point that we don't have a stated policy, but it's become the practice that we've honored for
Many years.
many years. Yeah.
A decade at least.
At least.
I can
So the, as part of that process, as I mentioned, it's not just talking to the firms about what's going on, but also leveraging some of the quantitative analysis that we produce at Rokatan and talking through that with TRS to understand what's going on in the portfolio and framing the performance and the holdings in terms of, is this what we would expect from the manager? And if there's something that appears to be outside the range of expectations, we go through sort of a punch list of things we want to cover off with the managers. And so there's a lot of words on page 2 that I think explain that. Slide 3. Slide 3 provides a little bit more detail and more words that try to outline what it is we're looking for with respect to the managers. So, for example, when there's active managers whose performance has been poor on a relative basis, using the analytics to try and identify what's going on in the performance, but also using that as a tool to talk to the managers and helping us understand why or why not they're performing in line with our expectations and their expectations. And so I think that allows us to have a more robust discussion with the managers, and using attribution and different ways of measuring risk to evaluate what's going on. And I think where we've had really notable discussions in the past has led to us bringing recommendations back to the board. I think maybe the most significant outcome of these discussions in recent years was the move to performance-based fees. And so that's an example. We've made countless manager changes over the years as a result of these regular discussions. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say that, if we bring something to the board that stands out as being an exception, when a manager then, we don't have a formal watch list for the passport funds, but when a manager is something that we're, trying to focus on and the performance has been particularly disappointing, we'll have a lot more touch points with them, and we sort of run through this process on a more regular basis to monitor for change. So I didn't want to sit here and read every word on the page, but we wanted to provide just a reminder that this process is ongoing. So far this year, we've met with, I want to say, every manager except those in the defensive composite. As you'll recall, we were in the process of making structural changes to that composite, and we're planning to meet with the rest of those managers later this year. So, Susan, anything you wanted to add on that process?
I would just say that the context, this is somewhat on the QPP side, hiring managers, it's governed by the city's procurement rules. The specific statutory, exemption for the TDA managers from the PPP. So what Mike is describing is the process used by Rokatan to, both hire and monitor managers. And we do have a fair number of managers whose contracts are coming up for renewal, so that we thought it was a good idea to remind the board of the review process and monitoring process for our managers.
Can I ask a question just about the contract renewals? Presumably there are some managers that have reached, and maybe this doesn't happen in TDA, this is really my question. We at in the QPP, we have like a certain number of renewals and then we have to do a new search. Is that true with TDA too, or can we just renew them indefinitely?
Valerie should probably answer this, but no, since we're not subject to the same procurement rules, we don't have to do a new search for a certain group of managers every 9 years. So
They're evergreen contracts.
they're 3-year contracts that can be renewed
Without having to do the search.
without having to go through
We
the
can
whole
enter a new
renewal.
contract without having to go through a formal procurement
Yes,
process.
yeah, and so then that's why the the review process and the fact it's not that we just renew the contracts without thinking about them. We think about these managers all the time, like once a year formally with Rokutan. Rokutan meets with them separately. We meet with them separately, and depending on how well they're doing or not well they're doing, they may hear from us more regularly than
Understood. And then just on the 3-year contract expirations, do those renewals, are they subject to board approval, or does the staff do that on its own?
We bring the manager renewals to the board, like in executive session, there will be 3 manager renewals.
Okay.
Those 3 that will come up between now and the end of the year. And so it's, yeah.
Understood. I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you. Any other? Is that that's the end of your presentation, right, Mike? Any further questions for Rokutan or for the staff on this review process? Okay. Great. Thanks. So that concludes our public agenda for today. Am I correct?
Yes.
Very good. So I think a motion to go into executive session would be in order.
I move pursuant to Public Offices Law, Section 105, to go into executive session for discussion on specific investment matters.
Thank you, Deborah. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Dave. Any discussion? All in favor of the motion to exit public session and enter executive session, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? The motion carries. All right, we're back in public session. Susan, would you report out of executive session?
Certainly, in executive session, a manager update was presented and several contract renewals were discussed.
Thank you. I believe that concludes our business for today. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All in favor of the motion to adjourn, please say aye.
Aye.
It is unanimous. The meeting is adjourned.